Pay attention to the Muslim activist in the white kufi approaching the books on the ground. His name is Kabir. He raises his foot to stomp on them with fellow protesters watching. Then his legs freeze completely, unable to move.
My name is Kabir. I'm 32 years old, and on November 23rd, 2018, I experienced something that shattered everything I believed about Jesus Christ. I was leading a protest against Christians in Atlanta when I tried to desecrate their holy book. Then my legs completely stopped working. I was born into a devout Muslim family in Atlanta's thriving Islamic community. My father was an imam at our local mosque, and my mother taught Arabic classes to children every weekend. From the moment I could speak, I was reciting verses from the Quran and learning the 5 pillars of Islam. Prayer wasn't just a ritual in our household, it was the rhythm of our entire existence. 5 times a day, everything stopped, and we turned toward Mecca with complete devotion. By the time I reached my teenage years, I had memorized significant portions of the Quran and could debate Islamic theology with adults twice my age. My passion for defending my faith wasn't just academic interest, it burned inside me like a fire that demanded to be fed. I studied comparative religion, not to explore other faiths, but to better understand how to refute them. Christianity, in particular, fascinated and infuriated me in equal measure. The concept of the Trinity made absolutely no sense to my logical mind. How could Allah, who is one and indivisible, somehow be 3 persons? How could the infinite creator of the universe become a finite human being? These questions weren't just theological curiosities for me. They represented what I believed was the fundamental error corrupting millions of souls worldwide. I genuinely believed these Christians were committing the ultimate blasphemy by associating partners with Allah. In college, I became the president of our Muslim Student Association and spent countless hours in interfaith dialogue sessions. These weren't friendly exchanges of ideas. For me, they were battlefields where truth fought against deception. I came armed with verses from the Quran, historical arguments, and an unshakable conviction that I was defending the pure monotheism that Allah had revealed to humanity through Prophet Muhammad. The Christian students I debated were passionate about their beliefs, but their explanations about Jesus being both fully God and fully man sounded like philosophical gymnastics to my ears. When they spoke about Jesus dying for their sins, I felt a mixture of pity and frustration. How could they not see that Allah would never allow one of His prophets to be humiliated and killed? How could they believe that the all-powerful Creator needed to sacrifice Himself to forgive humanity when He could simply choose to forgive? After graduation, I became a youth leader at our mosque and started organizing educational programs to help young Muslims understand and defend their faith against Christian missionaries. Atlanta had a growing evangelical population, and I noticed more Christian outreach efforts targeting our community. Missionaries would set up tables near our mosque after Friday prayers, offering free literature and engaging Muslims in theological discussions. These encounters ignited something fierce within me. I watched fellow Muslims, especially younger ones, sometimes appearing confused or intrigued by Christian arguments about salvation by grace rather than works. Some even accepted Bibles or attended church services out of curiosity. Each time I witnessed this, I felt like I was watching souls being led astray from the straight path Allah had provided. I began coordinating with other mosques across Atlanta to develop a more organized response to Christian evangelism in our neighborhoods. We created educational workshops teaching Muslims how to identify and counter common Christian missionary tactics. We distributed literature explaining why the Bible had been corrupted and why Islam was the final, pure revelation from God. My reputation in the Muslim community grew as someone who could articulate our beliefs and defend them against any challenge. Community leaders sought my advice when dealing with interfaith situations. Parents brought their children to me when they had questions about Christianity from school or friends. I felt an enormous responsibility to protect the faith of every Muslim I encountered. The breaking point came in November 2018 when a Christian group began regularly distributing Bibles and Christian literature directly outside our mosque during prayer times. They weren't aggressive or confrontational, but their presence felt like a deliberate provocation. These weren't random evangelists. They were organized, well-funded, and persistent. I watched families leaving Friday prayers being handed colorful booklets with titles like Jesus Loves You and The Truth About Salvation. I saw teenagers taking these materials, and some even engaging in lengthy conversations with the Christians. The sight of young Muslims walking away with Bibles tucked under their arms while discussing Christian doctrine made my blood boil. Ask yourself this question: have you ever been so certain of something that you'd do anything to defend it? Have you ever felt such passionate conviction that compromise seemed like betrayal? That's exactly where I found myself. Every fiber of my being screamed that I needed to take action to protect my community from what I believed was spiritual deception. I called emergency meetings with leaders from 5 different mosques in the Atlanta area. We discussed various responses, from filing complaints with city officials to organizing counter demonstrations. Some suggested we simply ignore the Christian presence, arguing that our faith was strong enough to withstand any outside influence. But I couldn't accept such passive resistance. During one particularly heated planning session, a fellow activist suggested we organize a public demonstration to show our rejection of Christian missionary activities. The idea evolved quickly from peaceful protest to something more dramatic. If Christians wanted to distribute their books in our neighborhoods, we would show the community exactly what we thought of those books. I volunteered to lead the demonstration. The plan was simple. We would gather outside a major Christian conference being held in downtown Atlanta, and we would publicly reject their scriptures in a way that would send an unmistakable message. Other community members would bring Bibles they had collected from various Christian outreach efforts over the months. As the day approached, my excitement and determination reached a fever pitch. I felt like a soldier preparing for the most important battle of my life. I was about to stand up for Allah, for Prophet Muhammad, and for every Muslim who had ever been confused or misled by Christian doctrine. I was going to make a statement that would resonate throughout Atlanta's religious communities. I had absolutely no idea that I was walking directly into an encounter that would destroy everything I thought I knew about God, about Jesus, and about myself. The morning of November 23rd, 2018, started like any other day of righteous purpose in my life. I woke up before dawn for Fajr prayer, but my mind was already racing with anticipation for what lay ahead. After completing my morning prayers, I drove to our community leader's house where we had planned to gather for final preparations. The autumn air was crisp and Atlanta's skyline looked peaceful in the early morning light. I had no idea I was driving toward the most important day of my entire existence. When I arrived at the house, 7 other activists were already there, drinking tea and reviewing our plan one final time. The living room buzzed with nervous energy and determined conversation. We had collected over 24 Bibles from various Christian outreach efforts over the past several months. They sat in cardboard boxes near the front door, waiting to be loaded into our van. Every time I glanced at those boxes, I felt a surge of righteous anger mixed with absolute certainty that we were doing Allah's work. Our community leader, a respected imam in his 60s, offered a prayer for our mission. He asked Allah to give us strength and courage to defend the true faith against those who would corrupt His message. As we stood in that circle with our heads bowed and hands raised, I felt the weight of centuries of Islamic tradition supporting our cause. We weren't just a group of protesters, we were defenders of monotheism itself. Loading the van felt ceremonial. Each box of Bibles represented months of Christian missionary efforts in our neighborhoods, and each book inside those boxes represented an attempt to lead Muslims away from the straight path. As we placed them carefully in the back of the vehicle, one of my fellow activists commented that we were literally carrying the tools of spiritual warfare that had been used against our community. The drive to downtown Atlanta took about 30 minutes, and during that time, we practiced our chants and reviewed the order of our demonstration. The plan was straightforward. We would set up in the public plaza outside the convention center, where a major Christian conference was taking place. Thousands of believers would be entering and leaving the building throughout the day, creating the perfect audience for our message. When we arrived at the convention center, the sight that greeted us exceeded all my expectations. The plaza was already filled with hundreds of Christians, many carrying Bibles and wearing shirts with religious messages. Tour buses were unloading more conference attendees every few minutes. The energy was electric, and I could hear worship music drifting from inside the massive building. This was exactly the setting I had dreamed of for our demonstration. We wouldn't be protesting in some empty park where our message might go unnoticed. We would be making our statement directly in front of people who needed to understand the Islamic perspective on their theological errors. My heart pounded with anticipation as we found the perfect spot to set up our protest area. The process of unloading our materials and positioning ourselves strategically took about 20 minutes. We created a loose circle in an open area of the plaza where we would have maximum visibility from multiple directions. Other activists held signs with messages about Islamic monotheism and the corruption of Christian scriptures. I positioned myself at the center of our formation, ready to take the lead role in our demonstration. As we began setting up, curious conference attendees started gathering at a respectful distance. Some appeared concerned, others seemed genuinely interested in understanding our perspective, and a few looked defensive. The diversity of reactions only reinforced my belief that our message was necessary. These people needed to hear the truth about their theological mistakes, and they needed to see our complete rejection of their corrupted scriptures. The moment I picked up the first Bible from our collection, a strange sensation ran through my hands. The book felt heavier than I expected. Not just physically, but somehow spiritually significant. I dismissed the feeling immediately, attributing it to my emotional state and the importance of what I was about to do. This was no time for second thoughts or mysterious intuitions. I had a mission to complete. The crowd around us continued to grow as word spread throughout the plaza about our presence. I could see people pulling out smartphones to record what was happening. Some conference attendees were calling others over to witness our demonstration. A few began praying quietly, which I interpreted as their attempt to counteract our message through spiritual means. The atmosphere became increasingly tense as more Christians gathered, and our group continued preparing for the main event. I could hear fragments of conversations from the crowd, some discussing Islamic theology, others debating how to respond to our protest, and many simply expressing confusion about our intentions. The energy in the plaza shifted from the celebratory mood of the conference to something much more charged and confrontational. As I held that first Bible in my hands, looking out at the hundreds of faces watching our every move, I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose and righteous conviction. This was my moment to stand up for Allah, to defend the purity of Islamic monotheism, and to demonstrate our complete rejection of Christian claims about Jesus being divine. Everything in my life had led to this single moment of testimony. I carefully placed the Bible on the concrete ground in front of me, making sure it was visible to everyone in the surrounding crowd. The symbolism was perfect, their corrupted scripture lying on the ground while I stood above it as a representative of true, uncompromised monotheism. Several other activists positioned additional Bibles around our demonstration area, creating a powerful visual statement. The plaza felt unusually quiet as people realized what was about to happen. Even the worship music from inside the convention center seemed to fade into the background. Hundreds of eyes focused on me as I stood over that Bible, ready to make the statement that would define my legacy as a defender of Islamic faith. Have you ever felt so passionate about defending truth that nothing else mattered in that moment? Have you ever been so certain of your beliefs that you were willing to face any consequence to uphold them? That's exactly where I stood. Both literally and figuratively, as I prepared to bring my foot down on what I believed was the source of Christianity's fundamental error about the nature of God. I raised my foot high above that Bible, feeling the weight of history and the eyes of hundreds of witnesses. I was about to make my statement to the world. The Bible lay there on the cold concrete, its black leather cover reflecting the afternoon sunlight. I positioned myself directly above it, my right foot raised high in the air, while hundreds of people watched in complete silence. The weight of the moment pressed down on me like nothing I had ever experienced. This wasn't just a protest anymore. This had become a defining moment that would echo through Atlanta's religious communities for years to come. My fellow activists formed a protective circle around me, their faces filled with determination and anticipation. They had been chanting Islamic phrases, but now even they had fallen silent, waiting for me to complete the act that would symbolize our absolute rejection of Christian theology. I could feel their eyes on me, trusting me to be their spokesperson in this critical moment of interfaith confrontation. The crowd of conference attendees had grown to several hundred people. They stood at various distances, some close enough that I could see the concern and confusion in their eyes, others farther back, craning their necks to witness what was happening. A few were still recording with their smartphones, capturing what they probably expected to be a moment of religious desecration that would spread across social media within hours. I took a deep breath and felt the familiar fire of righteous conviction burning in my chest. Every theological argument I had ever made against Christianity, every verse from the Quran I had memorized about the oneness of Allah, every frustrating conversation with missionaries flooded through my mind. This single act would represent all of my years of study, all of my passion for defending Islamic monotheism, and all of my love for my Muslim community. The moment felt suspended in time as I began to bring my foot down toward the Bible. I was moving slowly, deliberately, wanting everyone present to understand the significance of what they were witnessing. This wasn't an act of mindless vandalism or emotional outburst. This was a carefully considered statement about the fundamental theological differences between Islam and Christianity. My foot made contact with the leather cover of the Bible. The instant my shoe touched that book, something impossible happened. Every muscle in both of my legs suddenly locked into place as if they had been turned to stone. I couldn't move my feet, couldn't shift my weight, couldn't even wiggle my toes inside my shoes. The paralysis was complete and immediate, unlike anything I had ever experienced or even imagined was possible. Panic shot through my entire body like electricity. I tried desperately to lift my foot, to step backward, to move in any direction, but my legs had become completely unresponsive. It felt like my nervous system had simply disconnected from everything below my waist. I could feel my legs, could sense the weight of my body pressing down on them, but I had absolutely no control over their movement. The realization of what was happening hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was trapped, standing over this Bible, unable to move away from it. My mind raced through every possible explanation: muscle cramps, pinched nerves, some kind of psychological response to stress. But nothing in my medical knowledge or life experience could account for the sudden, complete paralysis that had overtaken me. Fellow activists immediately noticed something was wrong. They rushed forward, calling my name and asking what had happened. Several of them grabbed my arms, trying to pull me away from the Bible, but my legs remained planted exactly where they were. Their attempts to help me only made the situation more frightening because it became clear that this wasn't something I could simply shake off or walk away from. The crowd of conference attendees began moving closer, their expression shifting from defensive concern to genuine alarm. I could hear fragments of urgent conversations, someone asking if they should call an ambulance, others wondering if I was having some kind of medical emergency, and a few beginning to pray audibly for my well-being. I struggled against the paralysis with every ounce of strength in my body. I concentrated on moving my left foot, then my right, then both together. I tried to rock my weight from side to side, hoping to break whatever was holding me in place. Nothing worked. My legs remained as immobile as if they had been encased in concrete from the knees down. The terror I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Being unable to control your own body, being trapped in place while hundreds of people watch, creates a level of vulnerability and helplessness that reaches into the deepest parts of your psyche. I had gone from feeling completely in control of the situation to being utterly powerless in the span of a single second. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, and my condition remained unchanged. Fellow activists were now openly panicking, some calling for medical assistance while others debated whether to try lifting me bodily away from the area. The crowd had grown even larger as word spread through the plaza that something extraordinary was happening. But then something even more impossible began to occur. Despite the terror and confusion of being physically trapped, I started to feel an overwhelming sense of warmth spreading through my entire body. It wasn't the warmth of embarrassment or the heat of physical exertion. This was something completely different, something that seemed to emanate from beyond my physical being and flow into every cell of my existence. The warmth was accompanied by a peace that made absolutely no sense given my circumstances. I should have been consumed with panic, focused entirely on the medical crisis I appeared to be experiencing. Instead, I found my racing thoughts beginning to slow down, my breathing becoming more regular, and my terror gradually being replaced by something I had never felt before in my life. As I stood there, unable to move but somehow feeling more at peace than I had in years, memories began flooding back from my childhood. Not memories of Islamic instruction or theological debates, but fragments of interfaith education classes where I had first learned about Christianity. Stories about Jesus that I had dismissed as corrupted mythology suddenly seemed to be replaying themselves in vivid detail in my mind. I remembered learning about Jesus healing the paralyzed, about his compassion for those who opposed him, about his teachings on love and forgiveness. These weren't academic memories anymore. They were becoming emotionally real in a way that terrified and amazed me simultaneously. Standing there paralyzed over the Bible, I began to wonder if what was happening to me had anything to do with the Jesus I had spent years arguing against. The crowd around me continued to grow, but their voices seemed to fade into the background as something far more significant began happening inside my heart and mind. I was trapped there, standing over that Bible, completely helpless, and beginning to understand that my paralysis might not be a medical emergency at all. The paralysis in my legs continued, but the overwhelming warmth that had begun flowing through my body was transforming into something I can only describe as pure, unconditional love. I had experienced many emotions in my 32 years of life, but nothing had ever approached the intensity and completeness of what was washing over me as I stood motionless above that Bible. It felt like being embraced by the very essence of compassion itself. My mind, which moments earlier had been consumed with panic and confusion, began to clear in the most unexpected way. The theological arguments I had rehearsed for years, the verses from the Quran I had memorized to refute Christian doctrine, the intellectual frameworks I had built to defend Islamic monotheism suddenly seemed to be reorganizing themselves in my consciousness. It wasn't that I was forgetting my Islamic education, but rather that I was seeing it from an entirely new perspective. Memories from my childhood interfaith education classes flooded back with startling clarity. I remembered sitting in a community center when I was perhaps 10 years old, listening to a Christian teacher tell stories about Jesus that my parents had encouraged me to learn for the sake of religious literacy. At the time, I had approached these lessons as academic exercises, opportunities to understand what Christians believed so I could better explain why they were wrong. But standing there paralyzed, those childhood memories took on a completely different meaning. I remembered the story of Jesus healing a paralyzed man who had been lowered through a roof by his friends. The teacher had emphasized that Jesus didn't just heal the man's body, he forgave the man's sins first, demonstrating both divine compassion and divine authority. The parallel to my current situation was impossible to ignore. I recalled another story about Jesus calling to a tax collector named Matthew, who immediately left everything to follow him. The teacher had explained that Jesus had a unique ability to see past people's mistakes and failures, calling them to transformation rather than condemnation. Even more relevant was the story of Saul, a religious zealot, who had persecuted Christians until Jesus appeared to him in a dramatic encounter that completely changed his life. These weren't just random memories surfacing during a medical crisis. They felt purposeful, as if someone was deliberately bringing them to my attention. The Jesus I had spent years arguing against, the Jesus I had dismissed as merely a human prophet who had been elevated to divine status by his misguided followers, was beginning to emerge in my consciousness as someone far more real and present than I had ever imagined possible. The warmth I was feeling intensified, and with it came an understanding that shook me to my very core. This paralysis wasn't a punishment or a medical emergency. It was an intervention. Someone was holding me in this place, preventing me from completing an act that would have been spiritually devastating, not just for the Christians watching, but for my own soul. I was being protected from myself by a love so profound that it was willing to stop me in my tracks. As this realization dawned on me, I began to understand that the Jesus I had been fighting against for years wasn't the distant, powerless prophet I had believed him to be. He was present, he was real, and he was demonstrating the same kind of divine power I had read about in those childhood stories. The paralysis in my legs was evidence of supernatural intervention, but the love flowing through my entire being was evidence of something even more extraordinary. I started to comprehend that Jesus wasn't opposing me in anger or seeking to humiliate me in front of this crowd. Instead, he was reaching out to me in the middle of my rebellion with the same compassion he had shown to every person who had encountered him throughout history. The very act I had planned as ultimate rejection was being transformed into an opportunity for the most important conversation of my life. The theological frameworks I had spent years building began to crumble, but not in a way that felt destructive. It was more like walls I had constructed around my heart were being gently dismantled to make room for something infinitely larger. The questions that had driven my opposition to Christianity began finding answers I had never considered possible. How could God become human? Standing there, experiencing divine love in human form, the question began to answer itself. If God's love was powerful enough to reach into my rebellion and transform it into encounter, then perhaps his love was also powerful enough to bridge the gap between divine and human nature. Maybe the incarnation wasn't a theological impossibility, but a demonstration of love's ultimate triumph. Why would God need to sacrifice himself for human forgiveness? As I felt the depth of my own rebellion being met with unconditional acceptance, I began to understand that the cross wasn't about God's inability to forgive without payment, but about his willingness to personally bear the cost of reconciliation. The love I was experiencing wasn't cheap or easy. It had required everything from the one who was offering it. How could Jesus be both fully God and fully man? Standing there, paralyzed, yet filled with peace, experiencing supernatural intervention wrapped in tender compassion, I was encountering someone who was clearly divine, yet unmistakably personal. The theological paradox was resolving itself through direct experience rather than intellectual argument. Fellow activists were still trying to help me, their voices becoming increasingly frantic as medical explanations failed to account for my condition. But their concerns seemed to be coming from very far away. My attention was completely captured by the encounter happening in the depths of my being, where years of certainty were being replaced by a truth that was both terrifying and wonderful. The Jesus I had fought against was standing there with me, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a savior to be received. Every argument I had made against his divinity paled in comparison to the reality of his presence. Every theological objection I had raised was being answered not through debate, but through demonstration. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself, when was the last time you felt completely known and completely loved simultaneously? That's what was happening to me as I stood motionless above that Bible. I was being seen in all of my rebellion, all of my pride, all of my misguided passion, and yet I was being embraced with a love that had no conditions and no limits. The realization was building inside me like a tide that could no longer be held back. Jesus wasn't just a prophet or a good teacher or even a misunderstood religious figure. He was God incarnate, and he was there with me, holding me in place until I was ready to surrender everything I thought I knew about faith, about truth, and about myself. The internal battle that had been raging in my heart reached its climax as I stood there paralyzed above that Bible. Every theological argument I had ever constructed, every verse I had memorized to defend Islamic monotheism, every rational objection to Christian doctrine was crumbling under the weight of this supernatural encounter. The Jesus I had spent years fighting against was right there with me, and his presence was undeniable. The moment of surrender came not through intellectual defeat, but through an overwhelming recognition of truth that bypassed my mind entirely and struck directly at my soul. Standing there unable to move, filled with divine love I had never experienced, I finally understood that I had been wrong about everything. Jesus wasn't just a prophet who had been elevated beyond his proper status. He was exactly who Christians claimed he was, God in human flesh, offering salvation to everyone who would receive it. The realization hit me with such force that my entire worldview collapsed and rebuilt itself in a matter of seconds. All of my certainty about Islamic doctrine, all of my confidence in my theological understanding, all of my identity as a defender of monotheism suddenly seemed like elaborate defenses I had constructed against a truth I was terrified to face. Jesus was God, and he had been patiently pursuing me through years of rebellion and opposition. Tears began streaming down my face as the full weight of my situation became clear. I had dedicated my life to fighting against the very person who was now demonstrating infinite love and patience toward me. I had organized protests against people who worshiped the one who was currently holding me in an embrace of supernatural compassion. The irony was overwhelming, but so was the grace being extended to me. My voice, which had been silent since the paralysis began, suddenly returned with startling clarity. Right there in front of hundreds of conference attendees and my fellow Muslim activists, I began to speak the words that would change everything about my life. The words came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, flowing out of me like water breaking through a dam. Jesus, I called out, my voice carrying across the plaza with surprising strength. Jesus, I believe you are God. I believe you are Lord. I surrender my life to you completely. The effect of those words was immediate and profound. The moment I acknowledged Jesus as my Lord and Savior, the paralysis that had held my legs for what felt like hours suddenly released. I could feel sensation and movement returning to my lower body, as if life was flowing back into limbs that had been temporarily separated from my nervous system. The freedom to move was accompanied by an even greater sense of spiritual liberation. I immediately dropped to my knees beside the Bible I had attempted to desecrate, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch the book that had become the focal point of my transformation. The leather cover that had seemed like an enemy to be conquered now felt sacred under my fingertips. This wasn't just a book anymore. It was the written word of the God I had just surrendered my life to. The reaction from my fellow activists was swift and devastating. The men who had stood with me in solidarity just minutes earlier now backed away as if I had become contaminated with something infectious. Their faces showed a mixture of shock, disgust, and betrayal that cut through me like physical pain. One of them shouted accusations of weakness and apostasy, while others simply stared in disbelief at what they were witnessing. The community leader, who had blessed our mission that morning, arrived at the plaza just in time to see me kneeling beside the Bible, tears streaming down my face as I praised Jesus Christ. His expression of horror and rage was something I will never forget. He had invested years in my Islamic education, had trusted me to represent our community with honor, and had sent me out that morning as a defender of monotheistic truth. Instead, he was watching me embrace what he considered the ultimate betrayal of everything he had taught me. The confrontation that followed was brutal in its intensity. Fellow activists surrounded me, demanding explanations, shouting verses from the Quran, and pleading with me to reconsider what I was doing. They couldn't understand how someone with my theological training and passionate commitment to Islam could suddenly abandon everything for Christianity. From their perspective, I had either suffered a complete mental breakdown or had been somehow deceived by Christian manipulation. But even as they argued and pleaded with me, I felt an unshakable peace that confirmed the reality of what had just happened. No amount of pressure or theological argumentation could diminish the certainty that Jesus Christ was exactly who he claimed to be. The supernatural encounter I had experienced wasn't subject to debate or rational analysis. It was simply true, more real than anything else in my life. The conference attendees, who had been watching our demonstration from a distance, began approaching with entirely different expressions on their faces. Where the Muslims showed horror and betrayal, the Christians showed joy and amazement. Several of them immediately began praising God for what they recognized as a miraculous conversion happening before their eyes. Others knelt down beside me and began praying, welcoming me into a family I had never expected to join. As I held that Bible in my trembling hands, feeling its weight both physically and spiritually, I was struck by the profound irony of my situation. This book I had planned to destroy in front of hundreds of witnesses was now the most precious object I had ever held. The words I had dismissed as corrupted mythology were now the foundation of my new faith. The Jesus I had argued against for years was now my Lord and Savior. The immediate consequences of my public conversion began unfolding around me with frightening speed. My phone started buzzing with calls from family members who had already heard news of what happened in the plaza. The Muslim community in Atlanta wasn't large enough for such dramatic events to remain private for long. Within hours, everyone in our network of mosques and Islamic organizations would know that Kabir, the zealous defender of monotheism, had publicly converted to Christianity. Right there in front of hundreds of people, I started calling out to Jesus with the same passion I had once reserved for defending Islam against Christianity. My voice echoed across the plaza as I praised him for his patience, his love, and his willingness to reach into my rebellion and transform it into worship. The Christians around me began joining in my prayers, creating a spontaneous worship service centered around the miracle they had just witnessed. Fellow activists made several more attempts to pull me away from the area, but I gently refused their help. I wasn't being held against my will or manipulated by Christian tactics. I was exactly where I needed to be, exactly where God had led me through the most extraordinary intervention of my life. The paralysis had been temporary, but the transformation was permanent. As the reality of my new faith settled into my consciousness, I realized that I had lost almost everything I thought defined me, but I had gained something infinitely more valuable. I had lost my community, my identity, my reputation, and possibly my family relationships. But I had gained eternal life, divine love, and a relationship with the Creator of the universe who had demonstrated his reality in the most personal and dramatic way possible. The Bible I was holding contained the words of the Jesus who had just changed my life. Every page would now be precious to me, every verse a treasure to explore and understand. The book I had tried to destroy would become my daily companion and guide for the rest of my life. The weeks following my conversion were the most challenging and transformative period of my entire life. The pastor who had witnessed my encounter in the plaza, Dr. Matthews, immediately took me under his wing and began the delicate process of helping me understand what had happened to me and what it meant for my future. He had seen dramatic conversions before, but he told me later that watching a Muslim activist surrender to Christ while paralyzed over a Bible was unlike anything in his 40 years of ministry. Our first meeting took place just 3 days after the Plaza incident, in his church office lined with theological books and commentaries. I sat across from his desk, still emotionally raw from the supernatural encounter, trying to process the magnitude of what had occurred. He opened our conversation not with theological instruction, but with a simple question about how I was feeling. The kindness in his voice broke something open inside me, and I found myself weeping as I tried to explain the overwhelming sense of love and peace that had replaced the anger and certainty I had carried for so many years. Dr. Matthews didn't rush me into formal Bible study or pressure me to make public declarations about my new faith. Instead, he focused on helping me understand the basic foundations of Christianity while acknowledging the profound loss I was experiencing. Converting from Islam to Christianity wasn't just changing religious beliefs. It meant losing my entire social identity, my community connections, and potentially my family relationships. The phone calls from family members began within hours of news spreading through Atlanta's Muslim community. My father, the imam who had raised me in the faith, called first. His voice carried a mixture of disbelief, disappointment, and desperate hope that I had somehow been misunderstood or misrepresented. When I confirmed that I had indeed surrendered my life to Jesus Christ, the silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought the call had been disconnected. My mother's reaction was even more devastating. She wept openly as I tried to explain what had happened, pleading with me to reconsider, to seek counseling, to remember everything she had taught me about the oneness of Allah. Her tears cut through me more deeply than any theological argument ever could. This woman, who had sacrificed so much to raise me in the Islamic faith, was watching what she believed was the destruction of my eternal soul. The community leader, who had blessed our mission that morning, demanded a meeting with me at the mosque. I agreed, hoping I might be able to help them understand that my conversion wasn't a rejection of them personally, but a response to supernatural truth I couldn't deny. The gathering that took place was more like a trial than a conversation. Respected Islamic scholars from multiple mosques questioned me for hours, trying to identify where my theology had gone wrong, what Christian arguments had deceived me, or what personal problems might have made me vulnerable to abandoning my faith. Their questions revealed their complete inability to comprehend that my conversion had nothing to do with intellectual persuasion or emotional manipulation. They couldn't accept that Jesus himself had intervened in my rebellion and revealed his divine nature through supernatural demonstration. To them, the paralysis I described was either a medical coincidence or a psychological reaction to stress. The idea that it might be genuine divine intervention was theologically impossible within their worldview. The loss of friendships was perhaps the most painful consequence of my conversion. Men who had stood with me in solidarity for years, who had shared meals in my home and trusted me with their deepest concerns, suddenly treated me like a stranger. Some expressed genuine sadness about what they saw as my fall from grace. Others showed anger and betrayal, feeling that I had wasted years of their investment in my Islamic education and leadership development. But even as I was losing my Muslim community, I was discovering a new family among the Christians I had once opposed. The conference attendees who had witnessed my conversion began reaching out with offers of support, prayer, and practical assistance. Dr. Matthews introduced me to other former Muslims who had converted to Christianity, and their stories helped me understand that the isolation and grief I was experiencing were normal parts of the transformation process. My intensive Bible study began about a month after my conversion, and it was unlike any educational experience I had ever had. Where I had once approached Christian scriptures as an adversary looking for contradictions and errors, I now read them as love letters from the God who had dramatically revealed himself to me. Every verse seemed to speak directly to my situation, and I found myself amazed by the depth and consistency of the biblical message. The Christian mentor Dr. Matthews assigned to work with me was a former Islamic studies professor named Sarah, who had spent decades in interfaith dialogue. She understood the theological transition I was navigating and helped me see how many of my Islamic concepts could find fulfillment rather than contradiction in Christian doctrine. The unity of God wasn't violated by the Trinity. It was expressed through the perfect relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The transcendence of Allah wasn't diminished by the incarnation. It was demonstrated through God's willingness to enter human experience completely. 6 months after my conversion, I was baptized in Dr. Matthews' church before a congregation that included many of the same people who had witnessed my conversion in the plaza. As I went down into the water and came up again, I felt like I was being buried with Christ in his death and raised with him in his resurrection. The symbolism wasn't just theological theory. It was the lived reality of what had happened to my old identity as a Muslim activist and my new identity as a follower of Jesus. The most profound change in my life wasn't theological, but relational. Where I had once related to God through religious obligations and ritual requirements, I now experienced a personal relationship with Jesus that was intimate, conversational, and transformative. Prayer wasn't just reciting prescribed words at appointed times. It was ongoing dialogue with someone who knew me completely and loved me unconditionally. My calling to share my testimony began about a year after my conversion, when Dr. Matthews asked me to speak at a small gathering in his church. I was terrified to tell my story publicly, not because I doubted its truth, but because I knew how extraordinary it sounded. Who would believe that a Muslim activist had been paralyzed by divine intervention and converted to Christianity? But as I shared what had happened to me, I watched people's faces transform with amazement and joy, and I realized that my story had power to encourage and challenge others. The ministry that has grown out of my testimony has taken me to churches, universities, and interfaith gatherings across the Southeast. I've shared platforms with pastors, debated with Islamic scholars, and counseled other Muslims who are questioning their faith. The irony isn't lost on me that I now stand in many of the same venues where I once argued against Christianity, but now I'm proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. The impact on other former Muslim colleagues has been one of the most unexpected blessings of my new life. 3 of the men who once protested alongside me have since begun attending Bible studies after hearing my testimony and wrestling with their own questions about Jesus. They haven't all converted, but they're exploring Christianity with open hearts rather than closed minds. My relationship with my family remains complicated and painful. My parents still hope I'll return to Islam, and family gatherings are filled with tension and careful avoidance of religious topics. But I continue to love them deeply and pray for them consistently, trusting that the same Jesus who reached into my rebellion might one day reach into their hearts as well. Jesus met me in my deepest anger and rebellion, transforming it into love and purpose. What is He calling you to surrender today? What certainties are you clinging to that might be keeping you from experiencing His transformative love? Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself whether you're open to being surprised by God in ways that might change everything you think you know about faith, about truth, and about yourself. That Bible I tried to destroy, I read it every morning now, and each day it transforms me a little more into the image of Christ. The words I once dismissed as corrupted mythology have become the foundation of my hope, the source of my strength, and the guide for my daily decisions. If you want to experience this same life-changing encounter with Jesus, pray with me right now and ask Him to reveal Himself to you in whatever way He chooses. He's been waiting for you longer than you can imagine.